Yeah. Okay. I think we're going to try and get started. If I can get everybody's attention. My name is Larry Davis, and I'm the chair of the Computer Science Department. And it's my pleasure and honor to introduce this afternoon's Colloquium speaker, Vint Cerf. So I can only tell you a little bit about Vint, because if I told you about all of his accomplishments, you'd never hear from Vint. I'd be up here for an hour. So currently he's a vice president, and he has the interesting title of Chief Internet Evangelist for Google. Google is an internet search company, for those of you who don't know. And the reason for this is back about 20, 25 years ago, Vint and his colleague Bob Kahn essentially invented the Internet, right? Co-designer of the TCP/IP protocols and the architecture of the Internet. And he's been widely recognized for this really incredible contribution. The large part of our economy depends on the Internet these days. In 1997, President Clinton presented the U.S. National Medal of Technology to Vint and Bob Kahn for founding and developing the Internet, right? And then they also won what's called the Turing Award. In computer science, that's the highest award given to anybody for truly fundamental contributions to computer science. And then in November of 2005, George Bush awarded Cerf and Kahn the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which is the highest civilian award for scientists in the United States. Now, in today's rapidly expanding government, I'm sure that Barack Obama will invent an even more prestigious award, and you can be certain that the first winner of that award will be Vint Cerf. And so it's my pleasure to introduce Vint, and welcome to the University of Maryland.
Thank you very much, Larry. Thank you for not introducing me as Al Gore. Okay. Are we in? Good. All right. Well, first of all, I appreciate the warm welcome. I'm just sort of stunned. The room was empty when we walked in about 20 minutes ago. And so, wow. I hope that I have something useful to say. I have to tell you that this interesting title, Chief Internet Evangelist, was not one that I chose. In fact, when they asked me what title did I want at Google, I said, how about Archduke? I thought it sounded pretty good to me, but somebody pointed out that the previous Archduke was Ferdinand, and he was assassinated in 1914, and it caused World War I. Maybe that's not a good title to have, so I was happy to settle for Internet Evangelist. Well, let me start by going back into history a little bit. This is what the predecessor to the Internet looked like in 1969, around December. 4 nodes had been installed, and I was lucky to be a graduate student at UCLA at that time, and wrote the software that connected this thing called a Sigma 7 up to the first node of the ARPANET. The Sigma 7's in a museum now. Some people think I should be there along with it. But this system was the beginning of experimenting with packet switching, with which I'm sure you're all very familiar. At the time, it was considered a really crazy idea. You know, if you were part of the telecommunications world, you knew that the way to do telecom was circuit switching. And so AT&T had absolutely no interest whatsoever in this technology, but they were willing to sell us leased lines so we could build our own packet switch net. Around 1977, after I went from Stanford to the Defense Department to lead the program, we experimented with getting 3 different packet switch nets interconnected. By the way, that's why it's called the Internet. We had the ARPANET, and when Bob Kahn came out to Stanford in the spring of '73 and said, I have 2 other nets. One's a mobile radio net, one is a multi-access packet satellite net, and of course there's the ARPANET, which Bob also worked on. And he said, the problem is, how do I get them all interconnected in a way that looks more or less uniform? They were different data rates, different delays, different error rates, different packet sizes, and so on. The consequence of all that was that Bob and I spent about 6 months trying to figure out a way to do that, and that's where the TCP/IP protocols came from, and the ideas of gateways. So we built this 3-network system, and for the first time did a demonstration that we could get all 3 of them to work using these new TCP/IP protocols. This was a particularly interesting test. There was a van that was built by SRI International who was driving up and down the Bayshore Freeway, radiating packets in this mobile packet radio network. The packets were artificially forced to go through a gateway. We didn't know they were supposed to be called routers then, so we called them gateways. Between the packet radio net and the ARPANET, and the routing for these internet packets was forced to go through an internal satellite hop inside the ARPANET all the way to Norway and then down by landline to University College London. Then it hopped out of that international extension of the ARPANET, went into another gateway between the ARPANET in England and the packet satellite net over the Atlantic, went through the packet satellite net down to a ground station in Etam, West Virginia, through another gateway back into the ARPANET, and then all the way across the country down to USC Information Sciences Institute in Marina del Rey. Well, if you measure the distance between Menlo Park, which is where SRI was, and ISI, it's about 440 miles. But if you measure the path of the packet, it was about 100,000 miles, because it went up and down twice to synchronous altitude, all the way back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean in the United States twice. So it worked. And I have to tell you, we were leaping around saying, it works, it works. If you have anything to do with software, it's a miracle when it works. So we were, so the chief internet evangelist not only believes in miracles, but he relies on them, right? So it was pretty exciting to get 3 different networks interoperating with the same set of protocols, because you could do almost anything to get 2 networks to interact by doing all kinds of conversions and whatnot, but 3 or more was a big deal. So if you fast forward to 1999, the internet looked kind of like this. Bill Cheswick, who at the time was at Bell Labs, did this automatic mapping program to take the backbone routing tables from the BGP protocol and show what the various autonomous systems were in the network and what their connectivity was. So each color is a different autonomous system. If you look at the 10 years later, 2009, it looks just like this. It's just bigger. And, there are more autonomous systems and more colorful and larger number of users. Speaking of which, the statistics of the net are very interesting. There are 625 million machines that are visible publicly on the internet. And I emphasize visible publicly because over time, more and more machines have come on the net that we can't see in the public domain name system. And the reason for that is that people have put up firewalls to isolate enterprise systems or university systems and the like, and so that not everyone can see and interact directly with all the machines on the net. But of the ones that we can see publicly, there are more than 500 million of them. The number of users on the net is estimated at about 1.5 billion, almost 1.6 billion. And the other phenomenon, which has taken place during the last 10 years, is an incredibly rapid growth of mobiles. 3.5 billion are estimated to be in use, and another billion may go into use this year. Some of them will be replacements, and some will be new additions. What's important to us at Google and anyone who is thinking of offering internet services is that an awful lot of people will first have their interaction with the internet through a mobile and not a laptop. And so anyone who's thinking seriously about offering internet services has to start thinking about the different avenues by which this interaction will take place and the constraints. Now, this is a BlackBerry. I have a G1 in my bag. This thing has a display the size of a 1928 television set and a keyboard that's suitable for people that are 3 inches tall. And varying data rates, depending on where you happen to be. So it's a very constrained environment, but a very important one for all of us who are trying to treat as well as we can the full range of users on the net. Speaking of which, where are they? This is another very interesting statistic. If you look, of course, you can see that Asia is now the largest single grouping of users on the internet. It shouldn't be too big a surprise. More than half the world's population is what we call Asia. Certainly China and India are part of that, and Malaysia, Indonesia, and so on. But they are only at 17.1% penetration right now. Europe is almost 400 million people, but I've given up making any projections about Europe because they keep adding countries. So, I don't know what to predict about Europe, but they're at about 50% penetration. North America, which used to be the largest single grouping of users, is now at almost 75% penetration. There isn't going to be a lot of growth in North America with regard to absolute number of users. So if you're thinking business on the internet, you really need to pay attention to these numbers because the business growth is going to come from Asia and Europe and some of the other parts of the world where the penetration rates are as you see them on the right-hand side of the slide. So this has implications for the languages that are needed, the styles and cultures of interaction, which vary from one country and one culture to another. If you don't pay attention to that, your business model may not work. And Google has learned this very, very clearly. We've opened up engineering offices around the world, in part to take advantage of people's native knowledge of language and of styles and customs. People don't interact the same way with the search engines everywhere in the world. And so there are some parts of the world where the Google homepage is thought to be incomplete because there's almost nothing there and there's this empty box. And it doesn't occur to them they should type something in it. They're expecting to see things to choose from. And so we've had to vary the appearance of the Google homepage for some parts of the world in order to accommodate their expectations. If you look here, this is just some other statistical pictures of the heavy penetration, the light penetration but heavy absolute population in Asia. And similarly, these are the penetration rates as you see it. The world on the average is about 23 or 24% penetrated, which means that the chief internet evangelist at Google has about 78% of the world to convert still. So if you guys want to help, let me know. Now, this is a very important chart. There'll be a final exam on this, at 5 o'clock. This picture has only one really important graph on it. It's the thing that's going down. And that is the remaining available IPv4 address space that the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority can hand out to the regional Internet registries. It's going to run out somewhere around 2010 or so. And I blushingly admit it's my fault. Around 1977, when I was at DARPA, about a year's worth of debate had occurred among the engineers helping to develop and test and implement the Internet as to what the address space should be. And one group wanted variable length addressing. And that went away very quickly because the programmers hated variable lengths. It chewed up extra cycles to find the fields in the header, and they said that sucked, so that went away. So the only other options were 32 bits and 128 bits. And they couldn't come to any conclusions. I mean, it's been a year of arguments. So finally, I had to get this program moving. I said, it's 32 bits, that's it. That'll be enough to do an experiment. It's 4.3 billion terminations. I figured even the Defense Department didn't need more than 4.3 billion terminations to do an experiment, right? Now, the problem is the experiment never ended. So here we are, 2009, we're going to run out. So in order to correct for that, there's IPv6, and I hope that the university is preparing itself to implement v4 and v6 in parallel. I'm proud to tell you that Google is doing that. We've spent the last 18 months, a little more than that, almost 21 months, implementing IPv6. So most of our services are accessible on both v4 and v6 platforms. Problem, however, is that the v6 environment is not evolving in the same way that the v4 environment did. In IPv4, there was a connected core. There was the NSFnet backbone, the ARPANET backbone, and if you connected to any of them, you were implicitly connected to everyone else with the v4 protocol, because that's how it grew. In the IPv6 world, people are implementing it, but it's spotty. And so just because you implement IPv6 doesn't mean you're necessarily connected to someone else who's implementing IPv6. Yes, you can tunnel through the IPv4 backbone, but tunneling is a very fragile way of building a system. And so one of the policy arguments that I've been putting forth is that the ISPs should relax their interconnection and peering policies for IPv6 because it's in their best interest to have a fully connected v6 backbone. Ultimately, and in the long run, some of the metrics that are used to decide whether you should peer as opposed to buying transit will reemerge. But in the early stages of IPv6 deployment, I think it's smart for everybody to be as connected as possible. 128 bits of address space gives you 340 times 10 to the 36 unique addresses. That's a number only the Congress could appreciate. Now, I used to go around saying that that meant that every electron in the universe could have its own web page if it wanted to, until I got an email from somebody at Caltech, "Dear Dr. Cerf, you jerk, there are 10 to the 88th electrons in the universe, and you're off by 50 orders of magnitude." So I don't say that anymore. There are a few other features of IPv6 that are relevant. One of them is that if you want to go into end-to-end encrypted mode using the IPsec protocol, you're required to enter that mode, whereas in v4 it's optional. And there are some other little features of the IPv6 address structure, including something called the flow ID, which I would say has not been experimented around with very much. But anyway, those are some of the important features. The most important thing about IPv6, though, is it just has a lot more address space, and it will allow the network to continue to grow. I mentioned mobility before, and the large number of mobiles. Not all of them are internet-enabled, but some are, maybe 15 to 20% now. But that percentage is bound to go up over time as more and more people choose to use their mobiles as information windows or as devices that allow you to authorize payments or to get access to the internet for its information value. One thing which I find an interesting potential is not to treat the mobile as a device which is the sole thing that you use to interact with the net. I had mentioned earlier that it's a limited resource, small display, small keyboard. Imagine, though, a mobile which has the ability to detect other devices that are nearby. For example, if my mobile could detect that there are projection units up there and could interact with it, then the small display area on the mobile could be replaced by something much bigger. Or when you walk into a hotel room, if the large screen, flat screen, high-res display were detectable to the mobile, it would be possible to display things that way. So what I'm thinking here is that mobiles should become more aware of their surroundings. We could invent protocols for that. We could use Bluetooth. We could use 802.11 or 802.15.4 6LoWPAN or some of the other standards for allowing these devices to interact with each other. In fact, imagine sitting in a car that is not yet internet enabled, but it has a local area network. Maybe it's got GPS receiving and a GPS display. You can imagine the mobile participating in that local network and giving to the car the ability to access the public internet. So suddenly the automobile becomes internet enabled. I think there are a lot of possibilities here. In fact, another one is that if you're like me, you have entertainment systems at home. And each one of the boxes in the entertainment system has a remote controller. And I usually wind up fumbling around trying to figure out which controller goes with which box. And when I finally figure that out, that's the one with the dead battery. So what I propose is that we get rid of all those remotes. We internet enable all of the entertainment equipment, put it on the house network, and then the mobile becomes a controller. Now, the interesting thing about choosing that architecture is that you don't have to be in the same room in order to interact with these devices. In fact, you could have a device on the internet, which you go to through a web page, at which you debate and discuss and negotiate what music and video you want to have on the entertainment devices, and then let that service figure out how to configure everything and get materials downloaded to your entertainment system. So you could be managing this thing from anywhere in the world. Of course, so could everybody else, and so it's pretty clear you need to do something about strong authentication and strong access control. But that's a good thing. I mean, we want to see strong access control, strong authentication become a part of the normal framework of the internet, because otherwise there are very significant vulnerabilities that we can't protect against. So I'm a big fan of forcing ourselves to introduce very strong access control mechanisms throughout the internet, including these kinds of applications. What we have noticed is that many of the mobiles do have access to GPS, or in some cases they can at least estimate where they are based on triangulation and the measuring the radio energy level among the various base stations that they might be interacting with. So these devices know where they are, and the consequence of that has been interesting to see. We watch people making queries, and what we've noticed is that if they are carrying a mobile, they often make queries that are related to where they are. The consequence of that is that geographically indexed information has become increasingly valuable. So people who build databases that have information about where things are, what's going on there, what used to go on there, what might go on there in the future, those kinds of information packages have turned out to be increasingly valuable. This thing is trying to tell me that I'm supposed to be lecturing now. Okay. Now, I sort of intellectually understood the value of this geographically indexed information, but I didn't really viscerally understand it until my family went on a holiday. We went to Lake Powell in Arizona. It's near a little town called Page, Arizona. And as we were driving into Page, Arizona, we planned to rent a houseboat and go out on Lake Powell for a few days. And somebody pointed out that there weren't any grocery stores on the lake, and that we were going to have to get all of our provisions before we got on the houseboat. So we started talking about what kind of meals we were going to prepare, and somebody said, "Why don't we make paella?" And I remember thinking, "Wow, I love paella. That's great, but you have to have saffron to make a good paella. Where the hell am I going to find saffron in Page, Arizona?" Well, I was getting a good GPRS signal, so I flipped out the BlackBerry and I went to the Google homepage and I typed Saffron, Page, Arizona grocery store. And I got back 3 choices with telephone numbers and a little map showing how to get to each one. So I clicked on one of the phone numbers, the phone rings, a voice answers, and I said, "Hello, may I speak to the spice department, please?" Now, this is probably a little store, and it's probably the owner of the store. "This is the spice department." And I said, "Do you have any saffron?" And he said, "I don't know, but I'll go check." So he goes off, and he comes back, and he says, "Yep, I've got some saffron." So we followed the map to get to the store, and I ran in, and I bought $12.99 worth of saffron. That's 0.06 ounces, in case you care. And we made a great paella. But as I was walking out of the store, I realized that I had just in real time gotten exactly the information I needed when I needed it. I didn't get the answer, "You can get saffron in New York City, 1,500 miles away." So what was important to me is that this ability to carry your information window on your hip or in your purse and to get information that's useful right now is really stunningly valuable, and more people are discovering that as time goes on. Well, there are more and more devices showing up on the internet, some of which I never in my wildest dreams imagined, like refrigerators or picture frames. I remember somebody ran into my office about 10 years ago and said, Vint, did you see the internet-enabled picture frame?" And my first thought was, boy, that sounds about as useful as an electric fork. It turns out it's actually a very nice gadget because you don't have to boot up Windows or log in or do anything. You just plug it into the telephone system or an Ethernet jack, or some of them I guess have 802.11 Wi-Fi, and it just every 24 hours goes and logs into a website which has been accumulating uploaded imagery, which you put on there from your digital cameras. So we have people around our family with these little automated picture frames. And we all have digital cameras, so we upload pictures of the nieces and the nephews and the grandchildren, and you get up in the morning and you get some sense for what everybody's doing because it just cycles through the imagery. Now, you can appreciate that if the website that these picture frames log into gets hacked, the grandparents may see pictures that they hope are not of the grandchildren. So suddenly security and access control once again become an important element of the utility of some of these things. And that theme, I think, is going to recur more and more as we rely on and make more use of this connectivity that the internet confers. There are things that look like telephones that are actually voice over IP devices. Of course, your laptop is doing Skype and iChat and some of the other Google Talk things already. And then there's this guy in the middle who invented an internet-enabled surfboard. He's in the Netherlands, and I guess one day he must have been out waiting on the water for the next wave, thinking, if I had a laptop in my surfboard, I could be surfing the internet while I'm waiting, So he built this laptop into his surfboard, and then he put a Wi-Fi server on the rescue shack, and now he's got a product, an internet-enabled surfboard. So my prediction is that there are going to be billions of devices on the net, more devices than there are people. And many of them you see, when you walk into a hotel room, you see web TV and a little, radio-connected or IR-connected keyboard. Everybody's PDA here, anyway, is probably Internet-enabled. Video games are Internet-enabled. People talk to each other while they're shooting at each other. Makes for a great video conference. And there are washing machines. IBM apparently partnered with a company called Miele, which makes very high-end washing machines, for use in academic settings. The students love it, right? You throw your clothes in the washing machine, start it up, and then it sends you an SMS when it's time to move the clothes into the dryer. And that's great. You go to the bar and have a beer, and then your clothes tell you when it's time to come and pick it up. It's very convenient. This internet-enabled refrigerator, when I heard about it, I wondered, so what do you do with an internet-enabled refrigerator? And one thought is that it has a nice liquid crystal display, a touch-sensitive thing, and it's a way for Americans anyway to augment the family communication system, which typically consists of magnets and paper on the front of the refrigerator. Now you can augment the family communications with blogs and web pages and email and things of that sort, instant messaging. Then I got to thinking about the possibility that you could put RFID chips on the things you put inside the refrigerator so that the refrigerator could know what it has inside. So while you're at school or working, it's surfing the net looking for recipes that it could make. And when you come home, you see a nice list of things you could do for dinner, which I thought sounded pretty cool. Then the Japanese came along and built an internet-enabled bathroom scale. You step on the scale and it figures out which family member you are based on your weight, and it sends that information to the doctor to become part of your medical record. it seems perfectly okay except for one problem. The refrigerator's on the same network. So, you come home and you see diet recipes coming up on the display, or maybe it just refuses to open because it knows you're on a diet. This is bad. Now, a lot of you may be in the computer science and electrical engineering field, and I have bad news to tell you that you can't get the Nobel Prize. And the reason for that is that Mr. Nobel refused to allow any branch of mathematics to be given a prize. Then you could say, well, what about the economics prize? And that doesn't use Nobel's money; it's somebody else's money. And it's usually, like John Nash, and the Nash equilibrium is clearly mathematical. But you don't get Nobel prizes for anything in computer science. So I remember thinking, well, we have to do something about this. So I got to thinking about quantum theory and the fact that quantum particles have this unique property that they can be in more than one state at the same time. Then I got to thinking about wine, and it occurred to me that wine in a wine bottle is like a giant quantum particle because it could be in multiple states at the same time. It could be absolutely awful, or it could be absolutely spectacular, or everything in between. But you don't know until you pull the cork. This is like Schrödinger's cat. Remember the Gedanken experiment where he had the cat inside the box with a little capsule of cyanide and a little radium, piece of radium, and if the radium emitted an alpha particle and broke the capsule, the cyanide is released and the cat would die. So you close this system up and you ask, what's the state of the cat? And the answer is you have to treat it as both alive and dead until you open up the box to look inside. If there are any cat lovers in the audience, no cats were harmed. This is a Gedanken experiment. So I thought about writing up my theory of quantum wine bottles and sending it to the Nobel Prize Committee to see if I can get some credit for that. I'll come back to some other stories about wine in a minute. And I don't have time to go through all the rest of these, but sensor networks are turning out to be an important part of our environment on the internet more and more. I have an example of that. I have a commercial sensor network that's running IPv6 on 6LoWPAN, 802.15.4 radio net, and it's sampling every 5 minutes the temperature and humidity and light levels in every room in the house, and then delivering that to a server, and the server accumulates that over time. Now, I had an engineering reason for doing this. At the end of the year, I wanted to be able to go to the engineering people who were looking at my ventilation and air conditioning and heating system and say, it was either too hot or too cold, or look what the distribution was. And I didn't want anecdotal stuff. I wanted real data to show these guys. So that's why I did it. But one of the rooms is the wine cellar. And it's very important that the wine cellar stay below 60 degrees Fahrenheit and above about 50 or 60% humidity. So it's been alarmed, and in case the wine temperature goes up above 60 degrees, I get an SMS on my mobile. And that actually happened to me. I was at Argonne National Laboratory last year, and as I walked in the door, my mobile went off. It was the wine cellar calling. Your wine is warming up. So every 5 minutes for the next 3 days, I kept getting this little message saying your wine is getting warmer. My wife was away for 2 weeks on a holiday and couldn't reset the cooling system. So by the time I got back home, it was at 70 degrees, which is not the end of the world, but not a good thing. So I called up the Archrock people, and I said, you make actuators as well as sensors? And they said yes, so there's a vacation project to go install the actuator system. Another example why access control is important is I want the 15-year-old next door to turn my wine cooler off for me. Now, it gets interesting when you start thinking about what else could you do with this instrumentation. The fact that it detects light levels and reports every 5 minutes means that if somebody goes into the wine cellar and turns the light on, I may be able to detect that because I'll see a big jump in the lumens in the measure. So that might mean I could tell that somebody's gotten into the wine cellar when I'm not there. But it doesn't necessarily tell me that they took any wine out. So the next step is to put RFID chips on the wine bottles. That way I might be able to tell if any bottles leave the wine cellar without my permission. But somebody pointed out to me you could go into the wine cellar and drink the wine and leave the bottle there. So, okay, so this has to get a little more elaborate. We got to put sensors in the cork that can tell whether there's any wine left in the bottle. And as long as we're doing that, we probably ought to start sampling the esters that make the wine, tastes, the strawberry flavors and the blueberry or blackberry and whatnot. So after a while, you get to the point where you have a fully instrumented wine cellar and you interrogate the cork before you open the bottle. And of course, if you discover that bottle reached 90 degrees Fahrenheit because the cooling system failed, you give that bottle to somebody who won't know the difference. The very useful capability. You're going to see more and more sensor networks becoming a part of the internet environment. Part of the reason for this is that there is an opportunity for you and me to get a better sense for how we use our energy resources. So Google recently announced a power meter program that could allow you to put an instrument in the house that could tell you about which devices are consuming how much electricity. We don't have a very good feedback loop right now. We sort of know what our electric bill is per month, but we don't know what made it up. And so it's my sense, anyway, that feedback about how you're using energy, how efficiently or inefficiently, is a way of helping people decide how to be more careful and a bit more green about the energy that they use. So this year, 2009, is turning out to be probably one of the most dramatic years for the internet in its entire history. Not only is IPv6 starting to roll out finally, and we hope before it's absolutely needed, but the domain name system, which also has a number of vulnerabilities, is starting to be modified so that you can get digital signed answers back. When you make a query to translate a domain name into an IP address, today there's no guarantee that there hasn't been some interference, some modification, some cache poisoning in the resolvers that give you the wrong address and send you to a fake site. But if you could get a digitally signed answer back, which tells you that the integrity of that binding of the domain name and the IP address has not changed since it was put in by the holder of that domain name, then you'd have more confidence that the data you got back was accurate. So this is a hierarchical structure. Each zone file either is digitally signed or points down to and provides signed records for the next level down. One big issue right now is who signs the root zone file of the domain name system, and there are recent developments at the Department of Commerce which oversees both VeriSign and the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. There's some continuing discussion about exactly who should sign the top-level root zone, and that hasn't been fully resolved yet. The other big change that's happening is that for many, many years, domain names were mostly written in ASCII characters, a very limited set, 0 through 9, A through Z, and a hyphen. But there are those statistics that I showed you showing people all over the world using the internet. For many of them, their languages are not naturally written in ASCII characters. So there is great understandable pressure to augment the domain name system with the ability to write domain names in Cyrillic or Arabic or Hebrew or Urdu or Korean or Japanese and so on. Well, to do that, the Internet Engineering Task Force has chosen to use a system called Unicode, which encodes the glyphs of about 100,000 different characters. The problem is that as soon as you introduce such a broad range of symbols into the domain name expression, you run into the problem that some symbols look the same. For example, in Greek, Latin, and Cyrillic, a lot of the letters look very, very similar, and it's even worse when you start looking at some of the more elaborate languages. So, like PayPal, for example, could be written with a Cyrillic A, and the computer thinks it's different because the Cyrillic A is encoded differently from a Latin A. And so if you innocently click on something that looks like PayPal, you may end up at the wrong site, which invites you to log in, and which you do. And then it says, oh, there's a little problem, and it sends you over to the real PayPal, and you log in again. Meanwhile, it's draining the account using your username and password. So there are issues associated with the use of this extended character set, which requires some careful attention. I'm presently chairing the working group, in fact, on what's called IDNA BIS to try to finalize what the specs are for which character sets can be used. We cannot guarantee safety here. It's just not possible. It's just like 1 and 0 and O and lowercase l are confusable in ASCII. There are lots of other cases that we cannot find simple rules to rule out. So we'll try to rule out as much as we can, like punctuation and things like that, but the registries are going to have to also suppress inappropriate use of domain names. You might say, I'm not going to allow you to mix scripts inside of a label in a domain name as a way of resisting some forms of abuse. So that's a big set of changes for the internet in this year. I want to spend a little time here on cloud computing. The reason that I want to is that it is an interesting paradigm that people are addressing. If you read any history of computing, you will recall that in the 1960s there was a common notion called the computing utility. This was usually shown as a gigantic building somewhere with smoke coming out the top, and a huge computer inside, which everybody got to by way of the telephone system. Well, 40 years later, we have huge computing resources in big buildings with steam coming out the top, and everybody gets access to it through the internet. Well, except that the thing inside the building is not a single mainframe. It's actually, in the case of Google anyway, it's literally a classified number of computers in each domain, or in each data center, and the data centers are interconnected with each other. The cloud has some very interesting features. One of them is that you get to dynamically allocate the resources of the cloud to computation. So as computation demand varies for each user, you get to expand and contract the available resources for that particular user rather than having a fixed load, fixed assignment for tasking for each one of the machines. There are a lot of interesting side effects of trying to do computing this way. At Google, for example, because we want you to be able to get access to your information under all circumstances, we actually replicate a lot of data at multiple data centers. The consequence of that is there's a huge amount of information flowing back and forth between the data centers. We had to build a special private network, basically, to link all the data centers together. There are a lot of other interesting questions about how to make these data centers work well. Moore's law is broken, as I think you've all noticed. The problem is that the clock speeds are not going up. So the lazy programmers who got the benefit of increasing clock speeds so that their algorithms just ran faster because the clock went up, don't have that benefit anymore. And the, let's say the alternative to Moore's law, which instead of increasing clock speed is simply increasing total number of cycles available per chip, is achieving that goal by having multiple cores on each chip. But the clock speeds are not going up. The side effect of that is that if you have algorithms running that don't happen to be easily parallelized, you have a problem. You have to go figure out how to take a serial algorithm and parallelize it. You can't even necessarily get a pipeline out of that multi-core chip. It depends on how the chip interconnections are done and what kind of access you have to the common bus. There's another problem associated with the multi-core chips. It has to do with how much data you can push in and out of the chip itself. Can you push data back and forth fast enough to keep all the cores running on a set of problems? Those are the issues that have not been fully resolved. And for people who are looking around for dissertation topics, I can tell you that looking at cloud computing and multi-core chips and things of that kind could be a rich territory to do that. Finally, there's this question of, well, let me go one more here. All right, so now, I want you to think back for a minute about what the world was like around 1969. When the ARPANET was being built, there were networks out there that already existed. It was not the first computer network. But most of those nets were proprietary. So IBM had SNA, Digital Equipment Corporation had DECnet, Hewlett-Packard had DS, which I think stood for Distributed Systems. They didn't interwork with each other. Occasionally people would build gadgets that would let you, translate back and forth, but it was not a uniform system. So they were all proprietary. And in fact, those networks didn't know that there existed any other nets. They couldn't even express the idea of go from this net to that net, particularly from an SNA network to a DECnet. So the internet was designed to overcome the problem of expressing the idea of moving data from one net to another. People are going to build clouds for very good economic reasons, but they're going to build multiple clouds. The clouds don't have any vocabulary right now for referring to another cloud. We're back in the 1960s and the days when networks didn't know about each other. So I believe that there are some really interesting dissertation topics waiting to be written to talk about intercloud interactions. Example, I've got data sitting in cloud A. And let's even imagine the data is protected. It's access controlled. There's metadata associated with it that Cloud A is responsible for controlling access to. And you decide that you want to either replicate the data in another cloud or move it to another cloud. So the first problem is, how do I say that? The first cloud needs to have a way of saying, send this to this other cloud. The second problem is, how do I convey the meta information that controls access to the data as it goes into cloud B? Does that mean I should stop, or is that just, oh, you leaned against the light switch, you have a prehensile butt? Okay. So anyway, the problem here is that we don't have vocabulary for talking about intercloud interaction. So if you're looking for an interesting area to research, you're at the same stage in the cloud world as we were in the internet world in the early 1970s. And I believe that there's some really interesting technical problems and some interesting design problems and invention opportunities that lie ahead. Let's see. I want to make sure there's some time for a Q&A here, so I'm going to be careful. I think I've already hinted at some of the access control issues here, but remember I mentioned strong authentication repeatedly. We tend not to use authentication very well. A lot of us still use reusable passwords, which is really a bad idea. If you've ever dealt with online services and you try to log in and it doesn't work, and then it says, if you forgot your password, click here, and then it asks you these secret questions. Well, some of you will remember Governor Palin had a little problem because the secret answers to the secret questions were discoverable on the internet, so they weren't really very secure. In fact, banks and securities companies often suggest, that you should have these secret questions that nobody else but you should know the answer to. I believe if you're going to use this kind of technique, I'm not a big fan of it, but if you use that technique, you ought to have the secret questions and you ought to have secret answers, but you better have the secret answer plus random number that is not going to be easily guessed or found on the internet by someone else. I would prefer to see strong authentication mechanisms where you use non-reusable passwords. Public key crypto gives you an opportunity for some kinds of things like that. I even like the idea of having a device that has multiple keys in it, which can be your proxy to represent yourself in a variety of different systems. And during the public key exchanges and the like, this little device could plug into your laptop. And when the application needs a new strongly identified identifier, you let that little device generate the appropriate keys and send the data back and forth. You need to access control that little device so that somebody can't pick it up and become you in the virtual world. You might do that with a fingerprint reader. We aren't quite at the point where we can put an iris reader in these little devices, although this Macintosh here has a little camera that's mounted at exactly the right place to do an iris scan. And you can do that from 2 or 3 feet away. Now, whether this has enough resolution to do it, I don't know. Maybe not. But the notion of being able to do iris scans is an attractive way of authenticating. It's better than doing a retinal scan, where you have to get right up close to the thing, or sticking your finger into a hole somewhere and hoping that it will be there when you pull it out again. So my sense is that we should be able to build strong authentication devices that allow you to authenticate yourself based on what you know and something that you have. And if you lose it, that someone else isn't able to abuse it by representing themselves as you. So I've actually touched on most of these points here, but the thing I want to emphasize is that I honestly believe there's a lot of opportunity for people to explore issues associated with cloud computing that haven't been analyzed yet. Let me skip over that. Oh, there's another interesting situation here. It's one thing to just move data back and forth between clouds. It's something else if you wanted to get multiple clouds to actually cooperate with each other. I'm imagining sitting here with my mobile. It becomes my little cloudlet, right? It's the little access controller. And one question is, if it's connected to 2 clouds, does it become an inadvertent channel between the 2 clouds that was unintentional? This is sometimes known as a covert channel, which was unintended. Or can I use it as a controller and essentially cause things to happen between the 2 clouds? You need a vocabulary for that. You clearly need strong authentication and other things associated with it. So there's this list of questions I hope will stimulate some of your thinking about research. Let me switch gears for just a second and talk a bit about the semantic web. Now, I'm no authority here. Tim Berners-Lee would be a good guy to bring here if you can persuade him to come down from MIT to talk about that. And I have to admit I was very skeptical about this whole notion of semantic web, and I still have some skepticism, but I think I understood an idea that Tim had that I didn't understand before. Let me illustrate it by, I may not use the right vocabulary, but let me try anyway. Imagine for a moment that we have a way of expressing in our web pages the semantic ambiguities that we're faced with. So let's take the word Jaguar. We know it could mean the animal, could mean the car, could mean the operating system. Suppose that you are creating a web page and you notice that there's this ambiguity. So you actually write into the web page something that says Jaguar is ambiguous. Here's a web page where it's used as the car. Here's where it's used as the animal. And here's where it's used as the operating system. And you just embed that in your web page. Along comes the Google crawler or the Yahoo crawler or the Microsoft crawler, and it stumbles over this piece of semantic information. And it says, oh, that's an interesting fact. I didn't know that. So I incorporate that into my knowledge base. Now someone types in a query with the word Jaguar, and the search engine, which happened to have stumbled over the semantic hint, says, well, did you mean the car, the animal, or the operating system? Suddenly, you and I, are allowed to contribute semantic knowledge into the system, which is regularized by having the standard way of expressing it. So I get more excited about the fact that people might be able to contribute to the growth of semantic knowledge in the Internet. We've all contributed in one way or another to the content of the net, increasingly so. At Google, at YouTube, we're getting 15 hours of video per minute being uploaded now. We could argue over the value of those 15 hours of video, but the idea that people are generating a lot of information and putting it into the net is indisputable. Second thing I'm worried about, every time you use a program to produce a file, for example, it's a Word file or it's a Microsoft spreadsheet, or PowerPoint, or any of the other things that we commonly use. Maybe it's a photograph program or an emulation or a simulation. These are complex objects. These complex digital objects are not understandable or interpretable unless you have the software that knows what the format means and how to interpret it. If we ever lose the software that knows how to interpret the files, all we will have is a pile of rotten bits because they won't be meaningful. And what I'm worried about, quite honestly, is that we don't have a regular process of preserving enough information to assure that our complex digital files will be meaningful over a period of time. And here I'm not talking about 5 years or 10 years. I'm talking about hundreds of years. Now, I have a picture over here, which you may or may not be able to see this very well. This is a manuscript that was written in 1200 AD. And it's still readable today, 800 years later. When you pull out a polycarbonate CD-ROM and somebody says, how long is this going to last? You'll be damn lucky if it lasts 10 to 15 years. And even if the CD-ROM lasts as a physical medium, will the software that knows how to interpret the bits on that CD-ROM last? And some people have poo-pooed this as an irrelevant issue. Of course, people will translate the important stuff into the new versions of software, and you shouldn't worry about it. And the stuff that didn't get translated wasn't important anyway. That statement was made in the presence of about 50 librarians. It took us half an hour to get the librarians off the ceiling because they pointed out that sometimes the importance of information isn't known for 100 or 200 years. So I am very concerned that we have a practice and a process for preserving the software that knows how to interpret these complex digital files. There's an intellectual property issue hiding in all of this. Suppose that you're company A and you decide that for good and sundry business reasons you're not going to support this piece of software anymore. And so you stop. And the next version of something that you make isn't compatible with it. But we have, hundreds of gazillions of bytes of data that's based on this thing that you're not supporting anymore. So we might come to you and say, well, you're not supporting it. Will you put that up on the net, put the source code up there? And you'll say, no, of course I won't do that because I'm using a lot of that source code for another product. So we might say, well, would you let us run that program so that it's accessible on the net remotely? And you may or may not agree to do that. But then you might point out, this thing only works on that operating system version. And so you better get the operating system up there too and say, oh, we have to go talk to that guy, right? Okay, so now we have to go talk to you about your operating system, and you say, well, actually, I'm using a lot of that code over again, and, you can't have the source code. So we have a question in my mind is how do you create the incentives for preserving the ability to interpret these data files? And worse, you may even have to emulate the machine that the operating system ran on, that the application ran on, that knows how to interpret the bits. So this is not a solved problem. And, some people will say, well, open source will solve the problem. I would argue that not clear that open source will solve the problem. And it certainly isn't clear that everyone will continue to evolve the open source to map into newer versions, mapping into older versions of software. So bit rot is a big issue. All right. Final report here is on the interplanetary extension of the Internet. This is not a Google project. I get time from Google to work on it, but I don't want you to run out of the room saying you just figured out that Google's business model is to take over the solar system. That's not what this is about. Basically, this project got started around 1998. Some of us, when I was actually at MCI at the time, and I met with some people at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and we were talking about exploring space with manned and robotic systems using the Deep Space Network, which has 3 big 70-meter dishes in Madrid, Spain, Canberra, Australia, and Goldstone, California, talking to spacecraft that are in orbit around the planets or flying past the asteroids or landing on the surface of Mars. What you see on the top portion of the screen there are 2 of the 4 Mars orbiters, Mars Express and Mars Reconnaissance Observatory. And on the bottom part, you see the rovers on the left. There are 2 still operating on Mars, and the Phoenix lander, which landed and ceased operation after about a month and a half or so at the North Pole of Mars. What you might not know, though, is that on the rovers, the long-distance radio, the one that was supposed to report results all the way back to Earth directly, didn't work. I mean, it did, but it overheated, and they had to reduce the duty cycle. So first the scientists were upset because the data rate of that radio was only 28.5 kilobits a second as it was. And so reducing the data rate meant less data came back. So they were all very upset. The engineers at JPL said, well, we have another X-band radio. It's on the rover and it's on the orbiters, but it goes at 128 kilobits a second, but it can only reach orbital altitude. It can't go all the way back to Earth. So they reprogrammed the rovers and the orbiters so that they would pull the data up from the rover and hold onto it till they got to the right place in their orbit to then transmit the data back directly to the Deep Space Network at 128 kilobits a second because the orbiter had better power supplies. It wasn't, down on the dusty surface. Well, speaking of that, the rovers lasted a lot longer than they expected. The original mission was like 90 days. It's now over 5 years. And one of the reasons it's continued to work is that the solar panels have remained cleaner than we expected. We thought they were going to get very dusty very quickly and then stop converting sunlight to power, and eventually the batteries wouldn't charge up enough. Personally, I think there's somebody up there dusting them off, but we haven't got them on the video camera. So the real answer, it turns out, is there are little dust storms on the surface of Mars, and they blow the dust off. The solar panels, you can actually see it when you're down in the operations station, and a little dust storm comes along, and you watch the voltage level go up coming from the solar panels. So anyway, we started talking about how to improve the networking capacity, not just the data rate, but the richness of networking that could be done. I'm going to skip over Google Mars, except to tell you, go to Google Earth and switch to Google Mars. The imagery is spectacular. The 3-dimensional views of where the rovers have been, all stitched together, so you can search around there and see what it looked like. We started out saying, why don't we build an interplanetary internet? And we thought, why don't we use TCP/IP to do that? It seemed to work okay on Earth. It ought to work on Mars, and it does. The problem is it doesn't work between the planets. And the reason is obvious, right? The planets have the distance between the planets is literally astronomical. And at the speed of light, the distance between Earth and Mars varies from 35 million to 235 million miles, which translates into 3.5 minutes to 20 minutes one way. So, try to do flow control with TCP with a 40-minute round trip time. It's a real simple flow control algorithm, right? You say, run out of room, stop. And if the other guy hears you in about 20 or 30 or 60 or 100 milliseconds, that's okay. But what if it's 20 minutes later and all this stuff is coming out to full speed, packets are falling on the floor, flow control doesn't work. Then there's the other problem. It's called celestial motion. Planets rotate, and we haven't figured out how to stop that. So the problem here is that you're talking to something on the surface, and the thing rotates, and you can't talk to it anymore until it comes back around. Same problem with the orbiters. It's a very disrupted system, and the delays are A, inescapable, and B, variable. This is not a happy environment for TCP/IP. So we ended up inventing a new set of protocols called delay and disruption tolerant networking. And to make a long story short, so we can have some Q&A, we have tested it on the surface of the Earth in a lot of different configurations, but we just started the deep space testing last November. NASA gave us permission to upload our new protocols to the Deep Impact spacecraft, which had gone up to rendezvous with a comet and launched a probe in it. The probe is gone, but the platform is still in orbit around the sun, very eccentric orbit. So it was on its way back towards Earth. We uploaded it in October, and we spent a month transmitting data back and forth between Earth and that spacecraft. Didn't drop a bit. I mean, it was really impressive, even when we had power failures and other kinds of things that were not planned. We tested it that way. We are going to upload to the International Space Station this summer, and we're going to reload the protocols on board the what we'll renamed Epoxy platform, same one, it's just going to a different comet. We're going to upload the protocols in the fall. So we'll have a 3-node interplanetary test going on before the end of this year. If those are all successful, then NASA will award us what's called Technology Readiness Level 8, which means this technology is ready to deploy in live systems. We've already started talking to the Consultative Committee on Space Data Systems about standardizing using the DTN protocols for all the space missions that are launched by the different spacefaring countries. The whole idea here is, and what we hope, frankly, I'm going to skip through this part, what we hope is that over time, every time a new mission gets launched and then completes its primary responsibilities, it can be converted into part of an interplanetary backbone network because everything will be compatible. Just like when you plug into the internet today, you can talk to the 600 million machines that are out there. So we're not trying to build an interplanetary network and hope somebody comes. That's not what we're trying to do. We want to build the capability to allow it to emerge from all the missions that are launched for scientific reasons. Okay, so that's up to the minute on interplanetary internet. Let me stop here and ask if you have questions. Thank you. We have a question here. Yes, sir.
Medical cardiologists may like to have instrumented patients.
Absolutely. And in fact, one of the things that we would like to do is to get the DTN protocols into mobiles so that we have resilience in the presence of noise and disconnectivity and everything else. Unless you were thinking of real-time transmission, yes. Well, if you want to have real-time transmission, then you need to have better connectivity than you get with a mobile. But the point is well taken. You'd like to do it so you don't have to be tied to the hospital bed. Okay.
EKGs. Mobile EKGs.
Sorry?
EKGs.
EKGs, for example. Yes. Well, they do that now. When you're in the emergency vehicles, they'll transmit EKG information back to the emergency room. But it would be nice to do that from home, for example, and to be able to get more other kinds of sensors about the state of health.
Blood sugar.
Say again?
Blood sugar.
Blood sugar. There are a whole series of. There are a whole bunch of things that one would instrument. That's true.
There's one other, if I could.
Yeah.
The only time I've ever emailed you in my life was to complain that you guys missed an opportunity.
Yes. The only one?
No, there's a very important one. Way back when, email was a matter of calling up other computers on the long-distance phone lines at midnight.
Yes.
That was when I were grad students in UCLA. And so it happens that we could never figure out a way of charging for the email because so many people were hopping.
Well,
and the ARPANET had a chance to charge for email, and if you only had...
Hey, no, actually, let me tell you something. I did try to charge for email because I built MCI Mail. It was a commercial system. I charged $1 for each email message, and it got paid for in 1983. Then I made the mistake of connecting it to the internet in 1989, and everybody said, hey, it's free over there. How come you're charging for it? And, of course, now here we are, and nobody pays for email. What people pay for now is to not deliver email, right? It's spam. Yes, sir.
Thanks for a delightful and informative talk. I wanted to see, your focus has been largely on the technology and devices.
Yeah.
But arguably the biggest change in the last few years is the social aspects and user-generated content. You mentioned YouTube, but its phenomena, it makes it number 3 on the web. And Twitter has 14 million users, and the number of social applications seems arguably the largest change. How is that affecting the internet?
Well, it certainly affects it in one way. People use it more and more for various things, and they use it in real time. Twitter is not necessarily... I've seen it create the flash crowd phenomenon. If any of you read David Brin, you know about flash crowds. And what Twitter and instant messaging do is create the moral equivalent of mobs in the virtual space. I'm quite serious about that. If you know anything about mob behavior, you know how people will assume things and then act on them without really understanding what's going on because they just see everybody else doing something. We should actually be attentive to the social effects of some of these online environments. Now, I just came back from Yale University yesterday, where we debated in the Yale Political Union the question whether the virtual social environments were real or not. And it was an interesting, very lively debate. The people who believed that the social networking is as real as the face-to-face interactions, they're different, but they involve real people, real feelings, real concerns. You can be as swayed by an online interaction as you can by a face-to-face interaction. I think the vote came 43-7 or something like that. There were a few diehards who believed that the virtual environment wasn't real, but for most of us, it has a lot of reality to it. It also has some negative forms to it.
The hate groups and terrorist groups are equally proficient and empowered by such social technologies.
That's right. Although, what Esther Dyson says, I think she's right about. She says that the antidote for bad information is not suppression, but more information. But it does put an obligation on each one of us who uses these systems to distinguish good quality information from bad quality information. So suddenly critical thinking is a very important piece. It always was, right? You could get bad information from radio, television, newspapers, magazines, your friends, and your parents. And you had to distinguish what was useful and what information you're going to use. The internet just sort of highlights that even more because of the huge quantity of information and misinformation that's available.
We have a question maybe further back.
Way in the back. Okay, so I don't know if I'll be able to hear you from there. I'm hearing impaired.
I'll try to shout. So one of the big debates going on now is about net neutrality, right? And this.
Yeah.
So my question is, do you think that there's any room in the future of IP in any kind of foreseeable time frame to maybe relook at things like low bandwidth reservation and so on, and kind of make the discussion more of a technical one rather than kind of a Boolean political one?
Okay, so net neutrality has been a big debate, as you know, and especially here in this part of the world. In fact, Time Warner just did a little unscheduled experiment on that didn't work out too well for them. Let me start out by saying that I've adopted the phrase non-discriminatory access to the internet as an alternative to net neutrality, and the only reason for that is that the term net neutrality has been so badly distorted that people who were against it were claiming that those who were for it believe that every packet should be treated exactly the same way, there should be no priority, you couldn't charge anybody more for using more capacity, and that's not true. My view is that you want to just assure that each user is able to reach every supplier of service or every other user on P2P fairly and equitably. If you use more capacity, more bandwidth than I do, it's not unreasonable for the ISP to charge you more. But the metric should not be how many bytes did you transmit, but at what rate did you transmit them? Because the resource crunch is not the total number of bytes moved, it's how quickly you move the bytes. So if I move a terabyte in a month, that's not nearly the stress on the net as moving a terabyte in 2 seconds. And so I don't mind being told if you want higher data rate that you have to pay more. So that's a tiered structure which I think is reasonable. I don't like the idea of an ISP saying to an application provider, we're not going to allow your traffic to go over the high-speed lanes unless you pay us. I think it's first of all, I'm already paying to get onto the net in the first place with whatever capacity I can afford and believe is needed. The consumer is the one that wants to be able to say, if I buy broadband network access, I want to use all of that capacity to get to that service over there, and you can't interfere, or shouldn't interfere with that. So, first of all, the metric should be data rate, not total data transferred. And second, I think we should be alert to anti-competitive abuses. But I do accept the idea that you can have tiered pricing and that you can treat packets differently. Some of them may need low delay or low latency. And some of them are going to be control traffic, which you clearly don't want to inhibit. But when the system becomes congested, I think it's fair to allocate the capacity in accordance with what the users are willing to pay. I also think users would like to have fixed pricing. So I would much rather know what my cost is going to be for the month and have my traffic rate capped rather than having a surprise bill at the end of the month. And if I don't like the service I'm getting, then I should be able to buy more if they're willing to sell more. The other thing I think is important is transparency from the supplier. The consumers should know what they're actually getting, and they should be able to measure that. So we should have tools that let people validate that they're getting what their contract says they should get. Okay, is that maybe all the time we've got?
I think that there's a reception. That was the last question. I think there's a reception outside. You're welcome.
Yeah, I'll be happy to chat as long as my voice holds up.
We have this plaque to commemorate your lecture, and this is the university.
Thank you.
All right, so we'll cover on that, and you can take that.
All right, I appreciate that. Thank you very much.